These were the very heart of German industrial production, but the Treaty of Versailles had made them into demilitarized zones. He regained the Saar by simple plebiscite in 1935. In March 1936, Hitler once again gambled on the inaction of the League of Nations and sent troops into the Rhineland. Once again, his gamble paid off. Once the Rhineland was regained, rearmament increased at a staggering pace. Diplomatically, the Germans still tried to convince the world of their desire for peace. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador to London, was crucial to this smokescreen.
Of Germany, that is, the entire German nation. A nation which, once and for all, has restored its sovereignty and which will never allow this sovereignty to be discussed again, but also a nation which wants nothing but freedom, equality and peace. Germany is convinced that also the British people, as well as the French people, want this new peace in Europe, based on a spirit of conciliation among equal sovereign powers.
But as the Germans spoke peace, preparations for war continued. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War erupted, triggered by General Franco and his right-wing nationalists.
Both the Italians and the Germans sent supposedly volunteer forces to aid the fascists, people who wore Spanish uniform and were officially only there as volunteers rather than as members of their country's armed forces. This was extremely valuable, especially for the new German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, in training, in finding out what aircraft would actually function well in combat, and for experience for their pilots and their air crews. The Germans came away from the Spanish Civil War very impressed by the strength of air power, particularly in bombing. There were a number of notorious cases, particularly the bombing of the town of Guernica, which earned them notoriety.
On the 12th of March 1938, German troops marched into Austria on the invitation of a newly installed Austrian Chancellor named Arthur Seyss-Inquart. Many of the Austrian people were sympathetic to Nazi ideals, and the occupation by German troops was meant to be a union of two sovereign states. In reality, the Anschluss, as it was known, meant the absorption of Austria into a greater Germany. Hitler was beside himself with joy. His beloved Germany was finally united with his homeland of Austria. Once again, the British and French protested, but did nothing. Now Hitler turned his attentions to Czechoslovakia, the state that he insisted had no right to exist. Bordering Germany was an area of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. This is where most of the Czech defences were located. Hitler called for the return of this to Germany. The Czechs refused. In 1938, Hitler declared himself the supreme commander of all German forces and immediately mobilized his Wehrmacht. In September, after furious diplomatic activity, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister Daladier signed an agreement with Hitler handing over the Sudetenland. In return, the Führer promised no more German expansion. The Munich Agreement was meant to bring stability to Europe. Chamberlain returned home saying, "I believe it is peace in our time." The Germans moved into the Sudetenland, but Hitler's ambitions were a long way from complete. The Wehrmacht continued to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia. Hitler flew into Prague, declaring that Czechoslovakia had ceased to exist. War was now becoming inevitable. After the occupation of Czechoslovakia, there was a flurry of diplomatic activity in Europe. In May, Germany and Italy announced the Pact of Steel. The British and the French formed an alliance, and the possibility of including the Russians was raised. Russia was the only country who had an army large enough to seriously challenge the Wehrmacht. Hitler's hatred of communism should have ensured their support for the Allies against Germany. However, on May the 21st, a non-aggression pact was announced between the Russians and the Germans. This stunned the world. The British replied by guaranteeing the independence of Poland. But Poland was to be the catalyst for the bloodiest conflict in history. In April 1939, a plan for the invasion of Poland called Fall Weiß, or Case White, was drawn up by the German General Staff. There was a natural enmity between the two countries, and Hitler was determined that Poland should be destroyed. On the morning of the 1st of September 1939, the Luftwaffe started a series of attacks on targets along the Polish border. 1 hour later, German combat divisions crossed the frontier between the two countries. The spearhead comprised of panzer divisions and the mechanized infantry. They raced around the flanks at high speed, cutting off supply lines and communications. The following artillery then pounded the bulk of the encircled Polish forces. The Luftwaffe mounted hundreds of strategic bombing missions against airfields, rail links, and communications centers. General von Rundstedt's Army Group South pushed towards Krakow and Lodz, and then on to Warsaw. General von Bock's Army Group North would drive south and west across the Polish corridor. The panzers at the spearhead of the attack were commanded by a brilliant General Heinz Guderian. The speed of the attack was breathtaking, with the panzers covering an average of 18 miles a day. The Allies demanded that the Germans withdraw immediately, but this was ignored. As a result, Chamberlain announced on the 3rd of September at 11 a.m. that Britain was now at war with Germany.
Although Britain and France declared war on Germany over the German attack on Poland, they made no effective military moves to help the Poles, and that meant that the Polish defeat was more or less inevitable.
The German army's tactics were to attack in a double pincer movement designed to cut off the Polish armies. The technique was spectacularly successful. The Luftwaffe's attacks had all but wiped out the Polish Air Force and severely disrupted communications and supply. Warsaw itself was initially well defended. A counterattack by Polish forces proved unsuccessful. On the 15th of September, the Germans told the Poles to surrender or be destroyed. The Poles chose to fight on. The German pincer closed on the Polish armies, with only a few managing to escape. To make matters worse, the Russians entered the campaign on the German side, advancing from the east. On the 21st of September, the Germans launched a massive artillery bombardment of Warsaw. On the 26th of September, the Wehrmacht launched an infantry assault on the city. 2 days later, the Poles surrendered. German tactics had been decisive.
Their use of air power in such a shock, devastating attack, coupled with this encircling attack from three sides, produced a new word, blitzkrieg, lightning war.
Poland's territory was split between the Germans and the Russians. Hitler flew in to take the victory salute in Warsaw. He announced that Poland had ceased to exist. The world was stunned by the speed of the victory. Ironically, Hitler had committed a large portion of his forces to the Polish campaign, leaving Germany exposed to an attack by the Allies. Once again, the Allies did nothing. Inactivity that followed were dubbed the Phony War. The French continued construction of a massive line of fortresses that spanned the Franco-German border, known as the Maginot Line.
Partly the Maginot Line reflected a philosophy that what France wanted was a large nation in arms and that it would fight the next war defensively, that it expected an enemy to attack and to be overwhelmed by fixed French defences and by firepower.
The British Army, in the form of the British Expeditionary Force, also pushed forward to defensive positions in France and Belgium. But still, no attack on Germany took place. The uneasy calm was shattered in the spring of 1940, when the Germans began an invasion of Norway and Denmark. This was undertaken to prevent vital iron ore supplies, sent by convoy from Sweden, being cut off.
These iron ore convoys needed to come down the Norwegian coast, and the British government, specifically the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, who unlike many of his colleagues understood that if you go to war at least you have to fight it, began to take a very aggressive posture towards these convoys. The Royal Navy began to force these convoys further and further into Norwegian territorial waters, and then the British took the critical decision to start mining Norwegian territorial waters in order to cut off these iron ore supplies to Germany.
Exercise Weser-Erbung, or Spring Awakening, started on the 9th of April with the occupation of Denmark. The whole operation took less than 24 hours. The following day saw German troops invading Norway, with German paratroops taking Stavanger Airport.